Thank you, Yvonne, and thank you for the CPB for organising this lecture. It's quite an honour and a hard act to follow to be allowed to speak after Professor Aksijit, and quite a special place as well to be able to speak here. So thank you very much for coming, and let me give a few brief reflections. Yeah, these are my slides on what we have just been discussing. One further one. I think I'm not going to stay long on this slide because it's already been demonstrated, I think, by the previous two speakers. Over the past few decades, we've been in a very lucky place in Holland, as in many other Western countries, where our labour market has expanded. Partly it's been demographics, partly it's been women entering the labour force. So as you can see, it's probably quite hard to read, but in the first four on the sheet on the left, you see in the previous decades our labour market has consistently expanded. It has even expanded even more sizably in the past few years, but if you look into the future, you can see more or less our labour market size stagnating, and in several European countries it will even decrease quite sizably. And at the same time, our labour market productivity growth, which used to be very strong, has been decreasing very steadily and is even approaching, on average, if you look at it over the past few years, something very close to zero, which is obviously a very worrying perspective if you consider all the demands, all the requirements that voters, that citizens expect of of government. I think, again, partly this has already been illustrated by Professor Aksijit. What is required for improving business dynamics? One of the first things that comes to mind is, of course, labour market flexibility. The Danish model is often held up as one that we should aspire to, where we provide both more labour market security than in most countries, but we also provide a lot of flexibility, and that's something we don't do well here in Holland. I think there's one part of our labour market which is extremely flexible. Those are people either on zero contract hours or people in a sort of special status on temporary contracts. But the majority of us have fixed contracts and are incredibly hard to fire. That's not only the case in the private sector, but even more so in the public sector. And for those people, there is little incentive to move to another job, but it's also very difficult for firms, of course, to quickly acquire new workers as well as to get rid of their present ones. As both Yvonne and Professor Aksijit pointed out, swift bankruptcy proceedings is something that the US is famous for, is something we don't do brilliantly here. We do it better than in other parts of the European Union, but I would add one more aspect to that. Not only should they be swift, but preferably, we often talk about a European single market, we would have consistent bankruptcy proceedings. Because not only are the rules different between the Netherlands and other European countries, but the manner in which these are implemented, the duration of going through these proceedings differs immensely between one member state and the other. And finally, of course, reducing the administrative burden for firms. It's something I think a day doesn't go by in government where we don't talk about reducing the administrative burden. I joined government just over 20 years ago, and it was something we talked about a lot of the time, and I think we did quite a bit of work on it. But over 20 years later, we are consistently talking about the whole time, and I think nobody disagrees that we should reduce this burden, but what is a real challenge is then identifying in which ways, because of course there are areas in which we are where there are quick wins or the so-called low-hanging fruit. But the problem is that all these laws we have, and a lot of our legislation comes from Brussels, and we have agreed to that, of course, as one of the member states. But almost every country implements it in a slightly different fashion. We all have our different supervisors, we have different national legislation, we have little national add-ons, which we call gold plating. And when every one of the 27 member states has a slightly different add-on and has slightly different interpretations by a supervisor, you de facto get 27 different regimes. And it's all very well to talk about national sovereignty and national democracy, but 27 differing national regimes makes it incredibly expensive for any firm to comply, and it makes it quite burdensome also for someone to decide to access a second market. And so if you were to ask me what would be the most important advice we could give to any government, it's to go back to this European basic level of legislation, so no gold plating, and also to ensure consistency between interpretation and implementation. And that is easier said than done, because the one thing that's even harder is to make new trade-offs when it comes to all these different rules. Nobody is for weak environmental standards. Nobody is for weak privacy standards. You get into very difficult discussions when you say, oh, we just have to abolish these rules. And I don't think that's the path that any of us should go down. But the path we can go down is to create maximum European consistency. And there's still a lot to be won there. And then let me move to the second focus that I want to spend a few minutes on, and that is technological adoption. And in particular, I'd like to emphasize the second word, adoption, because I think we are all aware of the pace of technological change. It's pretty hard to read a newspaper without reading something about AI and the massive impact it could have on, well, of course, businesses, but also just society and even our personal lives. But let me point out, I think, 2 points here. On the one hand, I think we love to talk about technological creation and the firms that contribute to that. Even though I've got nothing to do with it, I'm proud that in Holland we have the firm ASML, which I think about a dozen years ago, and most people here in The Hague had hardly heard of. It was a firm that only originated just under half a century ago as a spin-off from Philips, and now, of course, makes one of the most complex machines, maybe the most complex machine man has ever made. And that's a very fine example of one that's right at the forefront of technological innovation and creation. But at least as important, it's of course technological adoption. And the Netherlands is a small, or maybe medium. I was told when I represented Holland abroad, we're not a small country, we're a medium-sized economy, but we still only represent about 1% of global GDP and well less, I think, about 1/4% of the world's population. So obviously most technological innovation and creation is going to take place elsewhere. But we can, of course, assuming that we are one of the world's most developed, one of the world's richest countries, and we want to remain that, we can, of course, be at the forefront of adoption. And another interesting aspect to take into account is that just as agriculture has consistently declined as a share of GDP to, I think, only about 2% of the Dutch GDP, industry has also steadily declined as a share of GDP, whilst public services, have consistently increased. And there's quite a few sort of negatives have already been pointed out by Professor Uxajit and by Yvonne. And I'm going to add one more to that, and probably to most of the economists here are very familiar with it, the Baumol effect, that as we become richer, we have ever more services, ever more public services as well, and in these services it becomes ever harder to find productivity gains. But there's also a positive that I can add to that, and I want to spend a little bit of time on AI. As I just said, it's something that we all read about the whole time. It has been around for longer than a couple of years, but obviously in the past couple of years, a lot of attention has been given to it, but it's also become very accessible, even if it's just the simple, the ChatGPT options, but other various AI possibilities that small firms, consumers are adopting at quite a rapid pace. But I also think it's important to recognize that we are still at the beginning of this rapid adoption. And if you look at almost all here we have a few important technological innovations that we've had over mostly the past few decades, and one of them quite a bit longer, electricity. What you can see is that it has generally taken at least a decade, if not more, for these new technological innovations to be adopted by at least 50% of the population. So the ones that we are all familiar with, at least all of that most of us have grown up with in our working lives, have been, of course, computers personal computers, which can more or less, you can say, started off in the 1980s. Internet about a decade later, and again about a decade later, mobile telephones. They all took about 10 to 15 years to be broadly adopted. And taking the launch of, it's not entirely accurate, the launch of ChatGPT a couple of years ago, you can safely say we are still at the front, or the start of this AI adoption. And I think there are genuinely big gains that we can expect here in the near future. If you look at US investment at the moment in AI, it's taking up almost all the new investment of the large firms, and also there is obviously a massive bet going on in US markets on AI as the big promising thing that is going to deliver us a lot of growth and productivity growth. But I believe there are big gains for us here. Analysis has shown that the productivity gains to be expected are probably highest in services, are higher in services than in, for example, agriculture industry. I think it's probably very difficult to read. Yeah, it's even difficult for me to read. But right on the left, you'll find agriculture as a sector where you have the least possible AI productivity gains, and finance, IT, telecom, and a lot of the more high-end services are right on the left side of the graph with possible productivity gains. And in a way, you could see AI as empowering consumers, but also small businesses, suddenly providing them with access to massive, not only information, but the ability to analyze, to crunch data, which has never before existed at an extremely low cost. So in markets where there are huge information asymmetries, in service markets where intermediaries, for example, but also big firms sometimes are profiting from these large asymmetries, AI does enable consumers and small parties to close that gap. And there are big gains, we believe, and this is on the basis of an OECD analysis, to be got here. But again, adoption rates are crucial. I liked the phrase. It was a new one for me, that a lot of what Professor Aksijit said, that a lot of entrepreneurs are just about getting around. It's not contributing much really to productivity growth, and often even just at the bottom of the income distribution as well. And in an advanced economy, you would expect us to be able to pluck the fruits. To again use the metaphor that Yvonne was using, to pluck the fruits of AI more quickly than in a less well-educated or a less technologically adept population. But it's not a given that this happens, because a lot of small businesses keep more or less to the processes and that they have grown up with, and I find it very hard to expand beyond that. And if I look at politics, politicians generally love business, or they claim to love business. They always will say we love SMEs and we love the national champions. But that's something different to loving business dynamics and loving the changes that come with creative destruction and firms going bust, and new firms that none of us have heard of suddenly expanding and turning a market upside down, because that, of course, is part of the business dynamics that we need. And I believe that AI does offer big opportunities for that. But it's not a given that we will seize these opportunities as well as we should. Going back to a few recommendations, I think I already mentioned the first one. We have a very imperfect European single market, especially for services. We've created quite a complex web of rules. And again, I'm not here to say that we should sort of deregulate massively, but I think we can agree that, at least from a policy perspective, that it would be incredibly useful for Europe to have a truly consistent set of European rules that are interpreted similarly across our market of, I think, just under 500 million people. And as long as we don't have that, and every firm is looking at each national market and different rules to comply with, we will not make use of this European single market. I think it was the IMF or Professor Draghi cited it in his Draghi report last year, that the national rules or the national gold plating in European markets is so sizable that it's comparable to a tariff on services around 100% or over 100%. So if you were to compare providing services from one EU country to another, it's almost as if we're imposing a tariff of 100% plus, whether it's a physiotherapist operating in the Netherlands and trying to attract Belgian customers just across the border, or it's someone in advertising and sales or banking or insurance. And the reality is that in almost all those service sectors, you see extremely little cross-border activity. In fact, those firms which have been most successful in cross-border services are often American firms which have approached Europe as one market, often starting in a reasonably deregulated market. Think a lot of the IT services that we've been adopting over the past few years, whilst European firms are not successful and often stick to small national markets. So I think there is a really big gain that we have not yet even started trying to seize. Secondly, government can play a more proactive role. We already mentioned the labour market. The labour market it's almost as if it's become a sort of a consensus in Dutch politics no longer to talk about fixed contracts. I think a dozen or 15 years ago, several parties were saying, oh, we should do something about that. I've heard a few political parties saying we should do something about sick pay. I think we're just about the only country in the world where you are not only almost impossible to be fired during 2 years of illness, but you are also you get 100% of your pay and all your vacation fully paid out. Very comfortable, of course, for all us government employees, but also a big hindrance to firms that need to shed workers or need to adapt. And it's also almost, I've often challenged my colleague, can you name one country where we have rules that protective? And I believe there are very, very few. There is a handful, but these are generally not the countries we want to compare ourselves to. And a positive that I think we really could do more with, but also one that we don't always, I think, use to our advantage, is public procurement. Public procurement, aanbestedingen, it takes up over 10% of our GDP. I think it's about 11% of our GDP annually is basically private firms providing services or goods, but paid for obviously by taxpayers' money, publicly financed, but obviously implemented privately. And we can do it in two ways. We often apply lots of conditions which can actually make it less productive if we have all these little complex add-ons, and then it's not going to be very transformative. But we can also try to use public procurement in a way that does contribute to transformation. And there, I believe we have a challenge to improve our economy from a productivity perspective. And finally, there's not a simple solution. There's not a one size fits all. That's the case for public procurement, and it is, I think, good to be aware of the sort of. There's a danger that from a policy perspective we want to attain too many goals at once, and so when you have a big public procurement, you want to. Preferably, politicians may want national champions, and they want the best environmental standards, and they want the best diversity standards, and then they have lots of other standards, and before you know it, you're actually decreasing the opportunities for productivity gains and competition. So that too is something to be very much aware of. Another pitfall that I want to point out is that AI, especially within our not too flexible labour markets, and also, speaking for myself as someone who works for the government, AI will not necessarily deliver the gains we want. I think most of you should be able to read this, but let me take the the hypothesis that two employees share a task, and one of them is quite tech savvy, so he says, "Hey, let's use AI," and he can actually do the whole task on his own. And then he has his colleague says, "Well, he doesn't really doesn't have that much to do." And in Dutch government, and also for a lot of Dutch firms, it's not very easy to let an employee go, and there's not much incentive to do that either. So now the new situation is that the employee A is using AI, and employee B doesn't really do that much, and he gets new tasks, because we always have things lying on our desk, of course, and we can always think of a few new tasks, but employee B can actually become less productive, and this sort of loss of productivity can actually mitigate the productivity gains that we had, because employee A has decided to use new technology, say AI. So I think it emphasizes the point made in the lecture of Professor Axijit, that you can't just sort of turn one knob and then expect everything to go well, because it depends on on other circumstances, the broader business dynamics, your labor law, whether or not you are really going to reap the gains that technological innovation sows for us. Concluding, we generally believe there are big potentials for in AI adoption to boost productivity. Whether it's going to really create a sort of new curve upwards, I think, is doubtful, but at least to keep productivity growth in positive, there is surely more than enough potential, and both the private and the public sector. For the private sector, I think my key recommendation would be to truly create a European single market for services and goods, so to harmonize the internal market, but that means moving further than just having new harmonized rules, but going towards uniform implementation, and that means that if you don't have one European supervisor, you at least have the European supervisors committing to similar standards to such an extent that they genuinely are acting as one. You also need lower cost of organizational restructuring, and because if we don't have that, then we will have incumbent firms maintaining their size, and too few dynamics for new firms or medium-sized firms to grow, and finally using public procurement in a positive manner. And for the public sector, again, stimulating creative destruction, whereby my recommendation would be I have no influence on them, of course, are the negotiators for a new government, and we're still in an early phase, of course, with just two parties, but my recommendation would be to look at the labor market protection, because I really believe that government is, which consumes in a broad sense our public sector and semi-private public sector, close to 50% of Dutch employment nowadays. If there are little dynamics and little incentives for people to switch jobs, we are not going to stimulate this country to move forward in the world of technological innovation. Thank you very much.